For years, viewers of Bitchin' Rides knew Bryce Green as the man who could walk into a chaotic body shop and somehow make the impossible look routine. While Dave Kindig shaped the vision, Green became one of the familiar faces translating those wild designs into finished machines. He was not simply another employee standing in the background. He was the body shop manager, responsible for a demanding part of the process. And by 2019, he had become a recognizable television personality in his own right. But there was something about Bryce's story that television could never completely capture. Long before cameras followed him around the Kindig-it design shop in Utah, his path into the automotive world began with a wrecked car and a question from his father. Green has explained that during his senior year, his 1968 Mustang was hit in the front. His father did not simply pay for the repair. Instead, he challenged Bryce to figure it out himself. So Bryce taught himself welding, sheet metal work, bodywork, and priming. The damaged Mustang became more than a project. It became the beginning of a career. That detail matters because Bryce did not arrive at Kindig-it Design as someone who had always known exactly where he was going. He had originally been connected to his family's insurance business, but chose a different direction. He eventually went to Tech in California, earned an automotive technology certificate, and applied to Kindig-it Design. Dave Kindig invited him to Utah for a tryout. 2 weeks later, Bryce was back in Utah as part of the team. From there, his rise looked almost effortless from the outside. It was anything but. Green described the body and paint crew as a team built over years, with workers spending long days on physically exhausting labor and painstaking detail. By the time he spoke publicly about the shop's business in 2019, Kindig-it Design reportedly had a 6-year waiting list, while the television show was reaching audiences in 192 countries. Bryce was standing inside a business that had become far bigger than the garage he had first entered. And that success changed what people expected from him. Bryce was no longer just fixing panels or preparing cars. He was helping manage an operation where clients wanted classic shapes combined with modern technology, hidden electronics, improved reliability, and flawless finishes. He understood that the industry was changing, too. Younger enthusiasts were becoming interested in customization. New technology was entering traditional builds, and customers increasingly wanted cars they could actually drive instead of simply display. For viewers, that distinction would become important. The man who had once learned by necessity was approaching another moment where experience, independence, and risk would collide. This time, there would be no Mustang to guide him, and no father standing to tell him what to do next. Yet this is where Bryce Green's story takes an unexpected turn. Because when someone appears to be firmly established inside one of television's most recognizable custom car shops, viewers naturally assume the next chapter will look much the same. It didn't. Behind the polished cars, television appearances, and growing reputation was a decision that would eventually separate Bryce from the world that had made him famous. And the surprising part is that the clues to that decision were already visible in the career he had built long before anyone knew his name. The question was no longer whether Bryce Green could build something extraordinary. It was what he would build when he was no longer building it for Kindig-it Design. By the time Bryce Green became a familiar face on Bitchin' Rides, he had already spent years proving that he belonged in a world where perfection was not optional. Kindig-it Design was not an ordinary body shop. Every project carried the expectations of wealthy clients, obsessive car enthusiasts, and an audience watching the transformation unfold on television. Bryce's job placed him directly in the middle of that pressure. As body shop manager, he was responsible for a part of the process where even a tiny mistake could ruin hours of work. His reputation grew because he understood that reality better than most. The television audience, however, saw only part of the pressure. On screen, the shop could look almost magical. A battered vehicle would enter and eventually emerge with sculpted body lines, flawless paint, and the unmistakable Kindig style. But behind those finished cars was an enormous amount of physical labor. Sanding, welding, shaping, blocking, correcting, and repeating the same process until the surface was right. Bryce had built his career around that kind of work. His rise was not based on celebrity first. It was based on craftsmanship. His public profile also grew with the show. Bitchin' Rides introduced viewers around the world to the people behind Kindig-it design, and Bryce became one of those recognizable personalities. The series was still featuring him during its 7th season in 2020, with Bryce listed among the cast alongside Dave Kindig and Kevin Sheila. That makes what happened next even more surprising. In February 2020, Kindig-it Design announced that Bryce was no longer part of the company or affiliated with Bitchin' Rides. The public explanation was straightforward. After 5 years at Kindig-it Design, Bryce had decided to move on to other opportunities. There was no official announcement accusing him of wrongdoing, and there is no reliable public evidence that establishes the more dramatic rumors that circulated afterward. For fans, though, a simple sentence created a much bigger question. Why leave? Bryce had reached the kind of position many automotive professionals spend decades trying to achieve. He had a respected role, television exposure, and access to some of the most ambitious custom builds in the country. Walking away from that world seemed difficult to understand from the outside. But there was another side to Bryce's career that became increasingly important after his departure: independence. He had never been someone whose identity depended entirely on television. His experience with fabrication had given him practical knowledge that could exist outside the Kindig-it building. Over time, he had also developed products and business ideas connected to the bodywork trade. One of those directions involved specialized sanding blocks and automotive detailing products, eventually becoming associated with his own ventures. That matters because leaving a successful company does not automatically mean leaving the industry. Sometimes it means trying to take everything you learned and build something that belongs entirely to you. And Bryce's next chapter would test exactly that idea. The timing made the decision even more complicated. His departure came in the same year that the world was about to enter a period of extraordinary disruption. Whatever plans he had made for life after Kindig-it Design would soon face circumstances nobody could have predicted. For the audience, the image remained simple. Bryce Green had been one of the recognizable craftsmen inside a famous custom car shop, and then suddenly he was gone. But the real story was not simply about a man leaving a television show. It was about what happens when a craftsman who has spent years helping build somebody else's vision decides to bet on his own. And that decision would reveal a side of Bryce Green that Bitchin' Rides could never fully show. Once Bryce Green walked away from Kindig-it Design, the obvious question was what he would do next. The answer was not another television shop waiting to hire him. It was independence. The years he'd spent working with metal, bodywork, fabrication, and paint had given him something more valuable than television exposure: a set of skills he could turn into his own business. That distinction became central to everything that followed. Kindig-it Design officially announced Bryce's departure in February 2020, saying he was no longer part of the company or affiliated with Bitchin' Rides, and that, after 5 years, he had decided to pursue other opportunities. That statement is important because it is the clearest public explanation from the company itself. There is plenty of speculation online about what may have happened behind the scenes, but speculation is not the same as evidence. The documented story is simpler. Bryce left and began pursuing opportunities outside Kindig-it. What happened next revealed why the decision mattered. Bryce moved toward building businesses around the same knowledge he had developed inside the automotive world. One of the most visible directions was big kid custom rides, associated with automotive products, sanding blocks, tools, polishing compounds, microfiber products, and educational classes for people trying to improve their bodywork and paint skills. In other words, Bryce was no longer simply performing the craft. He was trying to build a business around teaching it and supplying the people who practiced it. That may sound like a natural career move, but there was a significant difference between being a skilled employee and becoming the person responsible for the entire operation. At Kindig-it, Bryce had worked inside an established system. Outside it, every decision carried consequences. Products had to sell. Customers had to be satisfied. Marketing had to work. And the reputation he had built on television had to translate into something that could survive without a famous shop behind him. There are also reports that Bryce worked extremely long hours during his Kindig-it years and believed his compensation did not reflect the responsibilities he carried. Those claims come from secondary sources rather than a formal statement from Kindig-it Design, so they should be treated carefully rather than presented as settled fact. What is clearer is the larger motivation described in accounts of his next chapter. He wanted greater independence, more control over his work, and the opportunity to build something of his own. Then came another challenge. The timing of his departure could hardly have been more complicated. Bryce left just before the COVID-19 pandemic transformed businesses, travel, events, and everyday life across the world. For someone attempting to establish independent ventures, that created an environment filled with uncertainty. The television platform that had helped make him recognizable could no longer be treated as a guaranteed foundation for whatever came next. And yet, Bryce kept moving. His story after Kindig-it was not a clean Hollywood-style transformation where one door closes and another immediately opens. It was messier, more realistic, and potentially more revealing. He had to turn recognition into trust, craftsmanship into products, and experience into entrepreneurship. That is the part viewers could easily miss. Bryce Green had spent years helping create extraordinary cars for someone else's brand. Now he had to discover whether people would follow him when the Kindig-it logo was no longer above the door. And the answer would not come from television. It would come from whether he could build a name that stood on its own. The most revealing part of Bryce Green's story may have happened after the cameras stopped following him. In late 2020, he launched Kindig-it Custom Rides, returning to the work that had originally drawn him into the automotive world, building cars. At the same time, the business he had started with his wife, Kindig-it Blocks, was beginning to prove that his skills could become something much larger than a television career. Bryce later explained that the company had nearly $500,000 in sales during its first year, an extraordinary result considering the timing. But Kindig-it Blocks was not simply another merchandise business. The idea had grown directly out of Bryce's experience inside professional body shops. While working on high-end vehicles, he noticed how difficult it could be to sand hard surfaces efficiently with conventional soft blocks. So he began experimenting with his own designs. The blocks were harder, flatter, and intended to make the process more efficient while reducing some of the physical strain that came from spending hours sanding panels. According to the company's own history, his co-workers quickly became interested in the prototypes, and that reaction convinced Bryce there was a real product hiding inside his workshop experiments. That detail changes the way his departure from Kindig-it can be viewed. He was not walking away from the craft he had spent years mastering. He was taking something he had learned through that craft and turning it into intellectual property, products, and eventually a company of his own. And there was another important difference. At Kindig-it, Bryce had helped build vehicles that carried someone else's name and vision. With Kindig-it Blocks and Kindig-it Custom Rides, his own name was attached to the result. That meant the successes were his, but so were the risks. Bryce later described the decision as a move toward his own opportunities. He told Voyage Utah that pursuing independent opportunities had been discouraged at the company where he worked, and that he believed his sanding block designs could become a successful business. He and his wife decided to take that chance in February 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically changed the business environment. The timing sounds almost unbelievable. He left a nationally recognized custom car operation and launched a new company just as the world was heading into lockdowns, uncertainty, and economic disruption. Most people would have considered that terrible timing. Bryce apparently saw it differently. Instead of returning to the security of an established employer, he continued pushing forward. And remarkably, the gamble began paying off. Kindig-it Blocks eventually expanded beyond the United States, with distributors reported in countries including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Canada. Meanwhile, Kindig-it Custom Rides continued giving Bryce a way to build the kind of cars that had always been his passion. By 2023, he described having a team of 9 employees and a schedule of builds extending years into the future. That is a very different picture from the one fans were left with when Bryce disappeared from Bitchin' Rides. He had not vanished from the automotive world. He had expanded his role inside it. The former body shop manager was becoming an entrepreneur, manufacturer, educator, and shop owner. His experience on television had given him recognition, but his success afterward suggested that recognition was not the only thing carrying him forward. Still, one question remained. If Bryce could build a thriving business after leaving Kindig-it, why had he felt the need to leave in the first place? The answer would come from Bryce himself, and it would reveal that the decision was about much more than simply changing jobs. By the time Bryce Green stepped away from Kindig-it Design, the biggest question was not whether he could still build great cars. It was whether he could create a future without the television platform that had introduced him to millions of viewers. The answer eventually became clear. Bryce did not disappear from the automotive world. He continued building custom vehicles through Big Kid Custom Rides while developing Big Kid Blocks. The company built around the sanding tools he had originally created to solve problems he encountered in professional bodywork. Big Kid Blocks describes Bryce as its creator and owner and says the idea grew from prototypes he made after finding traditional soft sanding blocks inefficient on hard, dense surfaces. His co-workers began competing to use the prototypes, convincing him that the invention could have value beyond his own shop. That may be the most important piece of the entire story. The thing that eventually helped Bryce build his own identity was not a television opportunity. It was a practical problem he had noticed while doing the work himself. He had spent years shaping panels, chasing imperfections, and demanding the kind of finish that custom cars require. Instead of simply accepting the limitations of the tools available to him, he designed something different. The result was a business that grew beyond a side project. Big Kid Blocks says what began as a basement project eventually became a mass-produced product used internationally. Bryce continued building cars while developing new tools based on problems he encountered in his own work. That is why the story of his departure should not be reduced to rumors about arguments, personalities, or behind-the-scenes drama. The official announcement from Kindig-it Design in February 2020 said Bryce was no longer part of the company or affiliated with Bitchin' Rides and had decided to pursue other opportunities after 5 years. Public speculation has continued, but the confirmed announcement itself does not establish a secret feud or scandal. What could be established is what came afterward. Bryce built businesses connected to the skills he had developed over years of automotive work. His career shifted from helping create another company's famous cars to creating products, projects, and opportunities carrying his own vision. And perhaps that is the truth hidden beneath the dramatic question. What happened to Bryce Green? Nothing mysterious had to happen. A craftsman reached a point where he wanted to build something of his own. That decision carried risk. He left a recognizable television role just as the world entered one of its most uncertain periods. But instead of allowing that change to define him, Bryce turned experience into entrepreneurship. His story became less about being the former face of a famous shop and more about becoming the owner of his own automotive future. The screen made him recognizable, but the years of craftsmanship gave him something more lasting. The confidence to create, experiment, take risks, and decide what the next chapter would look like personally. For longtime Bitchin' Rides viewers, that changes the way his absence should be remembered. Bryce Green was not simply a familiar face who suddenly vanished from the screen. He was a fabricator who used what he had learned, recognized an opportunity, and took the difficult step of betting on himself. The television cameras may have stopped showing his work at Kindig-it Design, but the work itself never stopped. And that is the part Kindig-it Design could never tell for him. Because Bryce Green's real story was never about disappearing. It was about finally building something with his own name on it.